Welcome to the Psych Ward Podcast, where we have conversations with everyday people about men. We believe that every man has an authentic version of himself. So we're on a mission, and that mission is to find an answer to one question. What does it mean to be a man? Welcome back to the Psych Ward Podcast, where we have real conversations about men with men. I'm Eric Ward, and as always, I am here with my co-host, Mike Lucas. Michael, what's shaking bacon?
Not too much.
I like that one. I might use that again.
Good. I like that.
So, as we continue on our search for the definition of a real man, we're going to turn our attention to an issue with which many men, real or not, often struggle. I'm going to talk about alcohol. When it comes to drinking or even drug use, the data, at least in America, is not very encouraging. If you look at young adults in particular, age 18 to 25, more than half of them, 54%, report actively using alcohol on a regular basis. 8% of them report heavy alcohol use. And the statistics are fairly similar for adults who are older than 25. The facts and figures aren't great either when you start comparing men to women. As men, we're much more likely to be regular drinkers, more likely to drink excessively when we do drink, more likely to get hospitalized because of alcohol use, and we're more likely to commit suicide drinking. Interestingly enough, this seems to start at a very young age. About 11% of American children and almost 15% of American American boys live with a parent who has an alcohol use disorder. So, kind of a heavy subject, but I think a conversation worth having. We'd like to introduce a guest that we have for today's podcast, Kyle Kothera. Kyle, welcome.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Oh, we're glad you could be here. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
I can tell you that I'm not very interesting, but
I've heard.
Yeah, so my name is Kyle. I have been working in or around mental health for quite some time now. Pretty excited to be on the podcast today. You know, I often struggle, just off the top, with being able to describe interesting things about myself. So I may need some help here, but I do enjoy talking about recovery. That is a thing that is near and dear to my heart, and men's issues as well. So I'm really excited to be on the podcast today.
So we obviously invited you to join us because you have some personal ties to this discussion about alcohol use. And I think it's more than just your professional work as a behavioral health professional. So do you want to talk about just, I guess, maybe a shorter version of your story when it comes to alcohol?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in a pretty standard, nondescript, working class family. We lived out in the suburbs, and my dad was he was an electrician for, I think, almost close to 40 years. And I would say that I had a pretty good upbringing when it came to family and things like that. But my father was an alcoholic, and presumably still is an alcoholic. So a lot of my early exposure to alcohol was through him. Seeing him just drinking in the house or not being in the house because he was out drinking. So that was kind of my early exposure to alcohol. And so for a long time, I actually rejected drinking and didn't do any drinking in like middle school and high school. Was very, very straight edge, as they say on the streets. So didn't go to parties, Probably because I didn't get invited to parties too. Let's be honest. But
I had the same problem.
I'll just tell everybody that I was avoiding them for the record. But no, I didn't really start my so-called drinking career until I hit college. And that's where I kind of made up for lost time when it came to drinking. I unfortunately was growing up when craft beer became super popular. And I immediately fell in love with the idea of trying every single craft beer under the sun. It was no longer like stealing your dad's old styles or Miller Lights or whatever from the fridge in the garage. It was like, let's get the highest alcohol content beer that we can get, and get as much of it as possible. So that was kind of my start with drinking in college, and then it kind of just progressed from there.
Do you remember your first drink?
I don't remember my first drink because the first time I drank, I blacked out. So,
Oh, well,
yeah.
So you don't remember because you blacked out, not because
correct.
Because it
So
wasn't.
I don't remember what it was.
Not because it wasn't uneventful.
No, it was probably uneventful, or it was probably eventful.
Very
I just
eventful.
don't remember.
Yeah.
That was another facet of my drinking. Was oftentimes I would drink solely to black out.
Wow.
So that was
From the start. That
from
was
the start.
like,
Yeah.
wow.
A lot of the impetus for my drinking career was just a lot of like deep-seated issues that I wasn't dealing with properly, and just reliance on self-medicating with alcohol. I wouldn't find that out until much later, but yeah, the idea for me was to drink the good stuff and then drink it to excess. So it wasn't a good combination because I also didn't have a lot of money. So those things don't really go well together.
And craft beer is expensive.
It is expensive. It's very expensive.
So it sounds like from the first time you drank, it was like excess. Boom.
Yeah,
Right out of the chute.
One of the things that we say in recovery is that it's a disease of more.
Yeah.
So that definitely fit me to a T.
Can you describe that? What do you mean by that?
So, like, I can give you the description from recovery, and then my own definition of that. So, like, in recovery, we talk about it being a disease of more in the sense that even with drinking especially, but even without, outside of that. So it kind of crosses over to different areas of life. So if you have issues with food, that's another example of more. Like financial decisions, like buying things. It kind of spills over in different facets of life. It can even, for me, more can be relationships. Just needing to gather as many people as I can and be friends with all of them, which can be kind of unhealthy at times for me. For me personally, it's always, if I like something, I need to have it all the time, or I need to have as much of it as possible. And it's almost a feeling of never being satisfied with the amount.
So when you said your dad was a drinker.
So he stopped drinking, I want to say, before I was 10, but he still drinks O'Doul's.
Yeah,
which is cheating.
Yeah.
Stopping drinking is only kind of the first step.
Yeah.
Because recovery is a program of action. It's a program of the daily reprieve from drinking, but also keeping your side of the street clean in terms of your emotional sobriety and things like that. That's also really important. So it's something that I think he still struggles with.
Really?
Did he doesn't sound like he did any kind of recovery program.
No, that was something that he never really clicked with him. I think he tried it a couple times only because my mom told him, but maybe not. Told is maybe not the best word. I think it was more so an ultimatum.
Yeah. Strongly suggested it.
Strongly suggested. Yes, thank you. That's a good way of putting it. So I think he did that, but then he never really went back.
Do you still have contact with him?
Yes, absolutely. I just saw him yesterday.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think a lot of the behavior that I saw when I was a kid made it difficult for me to have a really strong relationship with him. Because in kind of like what I was talking about earlier, how I rejected the idea of drinking, I think I almost rejected the idea of him as well. Because I kind of associated those two things. So I think that's kind of carried over to today.
Kyle, you've used the phrase a couple of times, your drinking career.
Yeah.
I don't know that, in 30 years of working in behavioral health, which includes a lot of addiction work, I don't know that I've heard somebody describe it that way. Where'd that phrase come from?
It's either something that I picked up from somebody or it's just my way of describing it. I cannot remember, to be completely honest with you, but it almost feels like it's extremely accurate for me because sobriety is, while it's something that I love and enjoy, but it's almost a job as well. So I think of it as like different eras of my career.
Yeah. So you said you kind of like Mike said, right out of the chute, you were drinking in excess. Was there a point where you, I guess, realized that you were an alcoholic, you were addicted, whatever term you want to use?
That's a good question. I had many people come to me and tell me that they thought that I had a drinking problem. And I don't think that ever really sank in until there were some legal ramifications to my drinking. And that's ultimately what got me into the recovery.
Do you mind telling us what those were?
Yeah, absolutely. So, unfortunately, I often made the poor choice of driving while intoxicated. And I not only was arrested once, but decided that it was so nice that I had to do it twice and was arrested twice. So
the accommodations were so nice that you wanted to go back.
I had to go back. It was a 5-star establishment.
So what was the process to get your license, all that straightened out after 2 of them?
It was a lengthy process. Cost me a boatload of money.
Expensive and long.
Did you do like DUI classes and pay lots of money for that stuff?
Yes, I did classes both times.
Both times, okay.
Which were really great, actually. I learned a lot in those classes. I wish that the first time around it had sunk in a little bit more.
Yeah.
But oftentimes with substance use, the first time doesn't always stick.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed those. I don't know. Can we plug places on this show? I don't.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's this really great place in Naperville. And now of course the name escapes me when I'm trying to remember it. It's this guy and his wife have been running it for decades. They are wonderful.
That's great.
They are wonderful people. So I did the classes. I got a lawyer, as one does, which is always a fun experience. Anytime you have to get
another expense.
Yeah, of course. Who was not the nicest person in the world. Almost, even though this is like his niche, like this is the thing he does, he's like incredibly judgmental and just made you feel bad. And of course, that's the type of thing that I like, apparently, because I came back to him for the second one too. So,
right,
I'm a bit of a masochist, apparently.
Kyle, was it care clinics?
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
Care clinics.
Care clinics.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent place.
When I was getting my master's in counseling, I did my internship at a place that does DUI classes. So I was the group facilitator for those, and so
excellent.
I know what you mean by I saw people more than once.
Yeah,
that came through more than once, and the first time it's like, I just have to do these classes and get done, and I'm going to fake it till I make it, and then very different the second and third time around.
Absolutely. And it was actually kind of shocking to me seeing some of the people that I had seen the first time. And there were also new people, and a lot of them were older, mostly men in my groups.
Yeah.
And it was kind of shocking to me to hear some of their stories, because they would tell me that there were some people that had like 8 or 9 DUIs.
Good luck getting your license back after that many.
Yeah. You know what the shocking thing is? Some of them still have their licenses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very shocking.
Yeah, it's real shocking. I would say that the makeup was maybe 90% men. There were very few women, at least in my experience.
I'd say the same.
So let me ask that question then. So this is an interesting sort of perspective, because Kyle, you come at this from the client perspective. Mike, you come at it from somebody who's done the treatment side of it. For both of you, I guess the question is, why do you think it's more men who end up, and it's not just DUI classes, it's inpatient treatment, it's outpatient treatment. Everywhere you look, there is a plethora of men in treatment, usually forced into treatment, as we often are when it comes to the process of change. But why so many men?
Yeah. I can tell you from personal experience that, and I think that this is, could be applied to a lot of men. There's a profound sense of loneliness sometimes being a man. And I often think that drinking is a way of coping with that a lot of men fall back on. Like from a historical perspective, I would think that like men's activities kind of all center around the act of drinking in some fashion. Like if you're going bowling, you're going to go get a pitcher of beer, or if go out to a bar, play darts, play billiards or something, there's always going to be beer or liquor involved in some fashion. I think that for a lot of men, it's an easier way to open up with each other if there's some social lubricant.
It's funny because I wrote about that in one of my books, and I talked about in particular, it's not even just the alcohol. I think men, we need an activity, right? Women will get together just for the purpose of talking and catching up and supporting each other. There's not too many men that do that. There are some, but not too many. We typically need some sort of activity. And the best example I can give from my life is, I have a smaller finished basement in my home. And many years ago, I put a poker table in there because I like playing poker. But I don't like going to casinos to play poker because people aren't nice in casinos. The other people that you're playing with are kind of jerks because they're all there to take your money and go home. And so I have a group of friends that we periodically have this poker game. And what's interesting is we will end up having the same conversations or very similar conversations to what our wives have when they get together. But we need that activity. And like most men, the evening usually starts out with, people joking with each other, making fun of each other, the same kind of running jokes that always come out. Somebody will make fun of my shirt or something like that. But then invariably someone will bring up some heavy issue, something going on with one of their kids or in their marriage or work or whatever the case may be. And it's interesting because I'm not a drinker. I've never really been much of a drinker. I didn't have my first drink of alcohol until after I was 21. When I was in my early to mid 20s, so I owned my own place. And about 2-3 times a year, I'd have these big parties and invite people over. And all of us, myself included, would consume large amounts of alcohol. And I finally, but at some point in my 20s, I realized, you know what? I mean, when I say large amounts, I don't just mean like 8 or 9 drinks, double that. And that's kind of the starting point, And I realized I had never, ever had a hangover and I had never gotten sick from drinking. And then I remembered that my dad's family tree should probably be sponsored by Jack Daniels. So I come from a long line of alcoholics and women who marry alcoholics. And here I am, very, very comfortable. Like, drinking was easy. And I knew just from my professional training and experience that there was going to come a day where I was going to wake up and drinking wasn't going to be easy. And by then it was probably going to be too late. And I think that was my fear. And that's really kind of when I stopped drinking. I will occasionally, if my wife and I are out for dinner, let me try one of those, and I'll drink a third of it and be done with it. But I'm just not a drinker. And now I think having some, kind of chronic kidney issues, I can't drink anyway. And it really hasn't been a loss for me. But my point to all of this is that when we get together for poker, I would say there's maybe 2 or 3 of them that will have a couple of beers, but that's it. Most of us don't drink. We never really have been big drinkers. But we need that activity. We need something to do. And it comes down to exactly what you're saying when you talk about men being lonely. And that's a whole subject that we can talk about for hours and hours and hours. But I agree that a lot of alcohol use comes from loneliness in men. I always make the comment that bars are filled with lonely people, who are surrounded by people and still lonely.
Absolutely. That was me.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because I always went in the same bar, and you have these, like, what's the term? Is it like parasocial, something like that? Relationships with people, where they know your name, but they know like a surface level about you, to the point, like, obviously you share things with the bartender or people in the bar, but you don't really have a close relationship with these people. It's almost like going back to the whole drinking career thing. It's like they're like your coworkers at the bar, and your job there is to get inebriated. And some people do it well and some people don't.
And there's almost a reward for getting inebriated. I don't know if you found that, especially if you go to the same place. Oh, there's Kyle.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's cool. He gets trashed.
Absolutely. And that was a big thing for me with drinking. Was I often tell this to people when talking about recovery, is like, drinking became a large part of my identity. Mm-hmm. And because at the time, I felt like I didn't have a lot of things that were interesting about myself. So drinking kind of became my thing.
Yeah.
As sad as that sounds. But like, I was the craft beer guy, Yeah. It was kind of a point of pride for me to be able to tell people, oh, you should try this beer, or you should try this one. You might like this. Almost like in the way that people who like film or like music, I kind of got the high of being able to recommend things to other people, because that's kind of the way that I like to interact with people in a bar. So I kind of got something from that. I don't know exactly what that is, but
odd question, and maybe this is me trying to be a psychologist for a second, so bear with me.
Sure.
But you've talked a couple of times about just not being interesting, not having much about you that might be appealing to other people, and how that might have contributed.
Liar. He's a liar.
I am a liar.
Well, it's fine. I didn't know Kyle when he was in his 20s, his early 20s. So maybe he was lame and boring. Who knows?
Kind of.
But here's my question. It's something that I've seen, I guess, in my career, is kids who grow up with an addicted parent, and especially alcohol addiction. Drug addiction looks different in terms of its impact on the child. And I think it has to do with the social acceptability of drinking and how it really just sort of infiltrates every aspect of a drinker's life. But I've met a lot of people who grew up in houses with a parent or both parents who were drinkers, heavy drinkers, alcoholics, and they shut down. That part of their personality maybe didn't develop. So, you talk about being boring and not really having anything interesting about you. And I guess I'm wondering if maybe that came from growing up in one of those households where it was always sort of unpredictable what was going to happen next, or you wanted to be quiet or just sort of, stay out of the way, and not grow and develop your personality like you normally would if that wasn't what was going on in your house.
Yeah, I would say that that's probably pretty accurate. It was more of a, my father wasn't like a violent man, but I think there was still a little bit of fear in that unpredictability of what could happen. So I think you absolutely nailed it on the head there about kind of not wanting to stand out, and kind of maybe we're a little bit of like retreating inside myself in a way that kind of was softened a little bit by alcohol later in life.
Well, and it's interesting that when you did start kind of developing your personality and coming out of your shell, you went immediately to the one thing that you knew, which was alcohol.
Yeah. Well, my parents would sometimes have parties, and I would see how my dad became a different person when he was drinking, for better or for worse. He's I love my father, but he's a very interesting person, and he's very gregarious and very the life of the party when he was drinking. So it was interesting to see him interact with other people. And I think I kind of mirrored that a little bit when I grew up.
I was just reading actually today that people who grow up in a household where they're criticized quite a bit, they learn to just kind of stay quiet. And they also learn that what they have to say is not important. Did you grow up in an environment that was where you were highly criticized or not?
I don't necessarily remember him being highly critical. He was just not very present. There was a bit of like emotional neglect in that regard. We did not have a very strong relationship when I was young. That's one thing that I wish that I could have a conversation with. And maybe down the road, this is something that I should do, is just have a conversation with him about drinking and recovery. We've never had that conversation. I did an amends with my father, but that was more so for me. Yeah. So we've never really talked about it in the sense that I've never talked to him about how his drinking behavior may have influenced my own.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be enlightening for both of you.
I think I told you, Kyle, about the one time after my mom passed, and I was in my early 20s, and I decided it was time to have the talk with my dad, and it had nothing to do with drinking.
Yes,
but it had everything to do with just all of this resentment I was holding on to against him. And my dad was a good man. He really was. And I think he did the very best with what he had. But he could be rigid and kind of inflexible and critical. He was one of those guys who turned everything into a joke, and he knew it wasn't meant to be funny. Especially when I was younger, he changed very much after my brother and I were raised and grown. He became a much softer, more gentle man. But growing up with him was not an easy task. And having that conversation I just sat down with him, and I remember I walked in, he was reading the paper and the TV was on, and I turned the TV off and I said, "Hey, would you put down the paper?" And we had a 3-hour long conversation. And I just unloaded all of these resentments I had against him, everything I was angry about from my childhood. And part of my reason for doing it was I had just lost one parent. I had one left. And I frankly didn't like him very much. And I didn't like feuding in the world for you and your brother. And I was scared to death that you were going to get into something that I couldn't save you from. And I remember sitting there thinking, that's enough for me. His methods weren't always great, but his motives were right. And I remember just sitting there kind of shaking my head and being like, yeah, okay. Like I can be done with this now. And I was. And we never became like the super close father-son hanging out every weekend kind of people. It just wasn't in the cards for us. And part of it was he was always moving and he ended up halfway across the country. But it healed a lot, just one conversation.
Yeah. It's always better to know where somebody's coming from, to kind of clear the air. Even if the two of you disagree, I think it always helps when you can be honest with the person you're speaking with, whether it's your father, your wife, so that they really know where you're coming from versus, kind of faking it the rest of your life. Like, I just tolerate my siblings or my, family, boss, whatever it is.
Kyle, one of the things that I'm curious about, when you really started your drinking career, were you in a relationship at the time?
Yes, I am currently with the person that I was when I started drinking. I was seeing somebody else, and that relationship ended. And that was also kind of a life event that kind of propelled me further into alcoholism.
Yeah.
But for the majority of the career, I've been with the same person.
Is she a drinker? Was she a drinker? I know it's a very personal question, but
When we were in college, she drank. I wouldn't say on the same level as I did. She kind of knew when she needed to stop, or like she kind of knew how far she could go over and still be okay. Whereas I just don't have that. I don't have breaks. There's no breaks at this rate. Yeah. Like for me, one. I actually envy people that can have one drink.
See, and Kyle, I've never understood the concept. My wife is a nurse, and if you're ever married to a nurse, you'll know that the sight of a cleaned upside down wine glass in the dish drainer is a daily thing. And she's one of those people that she will just come home, and it's not every day. It's not even close to every day. But it's not unusual for her to come home and have a drink after work just to kind of bring it down a level. And she works in oncology. It's very emotional work. There's a lot of loss. There's a lot of tension. And I get it, but I can't for the life of me get the concept of people having one drink and stopping. Like, what I always tell people, if you're going to drink, like, do it right. I don't understand the concept of like, oh, I got a tiny little feeling of something from one drink. That's plenty. Like, if you're going to do it, go all the way.
Exactly. I mean, if one is good, then 10 can be better.
So it's unusual, I guess, for me at least, to talk to somebody who went through alcoholism and recovery and to still be in the same relationship with somebody when it started. That's not common, at least from my experience.
Well, I'm very lucky to be with somebody who has been extremely supportive of me. I put her through a lot in our relationship, and she's really stuck by me, and I'm very thankful for that.
Is there guilt about that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
How do you deal with it?
That's a great question. How do I deal with it is a good question too. It's an everyday process.
Being sober, does that relieve some of the guilt?
It does. Just trying to be the best person I can be on a daily basis. It kind of stops me from doing certain things, like having difficult conversations with her about things. There's always that thought in the back of my mind, like, think about what you put her through, and then don't bring up this thing that bothers you, even if it's a very minor thing. Unfortunately, I'm very much a peace at any cost type person, and that guilt kind of plays into that a little bit.
I work with a lot of men in my counseling profession, and that is something that I think I hear over and over and over again. And it's not even just addiction. It could be having an affair. It could be domestic violence. It could be any number of things. And I think a lot of men start feeling that, I've already done these bad things to her. So if I disagree with her, if we have a heavy, kind of conflict laden conversation, then I'm just being more of a jerk. And so I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. And what I find is that a lot of them end up with resentments. And it's not even resentment toward their partner. It's often resentment toward themselves or toward situations or whatever the case may be. And of course, we know that resentments are just a good way to kill a relationship. But it's a struggle, I think, when you've hurt somebody. And let's be realistic. Your hurt toward her was probably very obvious because, when there's alcoholism involved, it's easy to see. But I think hurt goes both ways in every relationship. And, I see it's not even just men, it's women that carry around, that guilt and that unwillingness to engage because of their own feelings as opposed to concerned about the relationship. So you're kind of right in the middle of that millennial generation.
I'll be 34 this year. I'm like smack dab right in the middle between the Gen X and whatever. I don't even. What is it? Gen Z.
Gen Z. Yeah.
Gen Z. We don't talk about that.
Do you think, like, in that millennial generation, is there a lot more or less or the same alcohol abuse as you see in other generations?
I think it's different. I don't necessarily, I can't speak on if it's more or less, but it is different. There's definitely a different view of drinking from my own experience. Like when you're in a bar, it's kind of neat because it's kind of like a tiny microcosm of different cultures, different generations and things like that. Because you got your old timers who are sitting at the end of the bar. They've sat in for 40 years and they're drinking the same thing they always drink. And then you've got the young bucks that come in like me and they want to try all these things. They always want to try shots, like different shots. Why? What is with shots? I don't understand.
Get drunk faster.
I know, but I've never been, that's too small. That's a tiny drink. I don't like tiny drinks. 20 ounces.
What do they call it? A flight. It's a bunch of shots.
The idea of the flight is to me, a millennial thing. Is like I feel like drinking became almost like a fine dining experience for some people. Like, the idea of the sommelier for wine but now you've got this whole craft beer scene where drinking is now like an experience versus whatever it used to be. I think that the millennial generation has kind of turned it into like a trendy thing.
You think it's like a little more pretentious than it used to be?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look at some of the names of these beers. They're wild.
Yeah.
But I think even the attitude towards drinking, like for like general population of people, I think that while some people are still a little bit pretty, like, a little cavalier about it, I think the propensity towards mixing alcohol with drugs is much more prevalent with the millennial generation, particularly marijuana. Now, obviously, people have been smoking forever. I think that, at least in my college experience, the idea of drinking and then smoking was like a huge thing. So I don't know if that's exclusive to the millennial generation, but
I'm just thinking now they've done it with coffee.
Yeah,
That's become a thing.
Yep.
Marijuana.
Yep.
Bourbon.
Yeah.
Has made it into more of an art and it's sort of pretentious too a little bit.
Yeah. I think that speaks largely to the millennial idea of consumption.
Interesting.
Like it has to be some sort of art thing for it to be acceptable.
Yeah.
It's funny because I was doing a little bit of research for our conversation today, and I came in several different places. I came across this statistic that was talking about each generation and what percentage of them were daily drinkers. And far and away, the biggest percentage was what's called the silent generation. So the ones that kind of preceded the greatest generation, boomer kind of people. And for that group, 23% of them reported being daily alcohol drinkers. So 1 out of 4.
That's a lot.
Really. And the interesting thing is, as you went through, the greatest generation, the boomers and Gen X and millennials and now Gen Z, the percentage goes down every time. For Gen X, it's about 6% of Gen Xers report that they're daily alcohol drinkers. But for the millennial generation, it's 2.4%. Now, again, we're talking about daily alcohol use as opposed to alcohol use in general. And I think it's both difficult and expensive to drink daily. No matter how much you drink. But it was just interesting to me that every generation has used less and less alcohol. What was interesting was the jump from the silent generation, at 23%, to the next generation was something like 11%. It was like half.
That's amazing.
Wow.
Of those people. You got to wonder how much of it really comes from, like you had talked about, watching a parent drink and seeing the effects of that. When I joke about my dad's family, their family tree being sponsored by Jack Daniels, but what's interesting is he has a generation, I think he has 16 first cousins, and they all grew up together, same town, same area. And with a couple of exceptions, none of them drink. And they never talked about it. They never sat down and had a conversation about it. It was almost like they all looked at their parents and went, yeah, no, I'm not doing that, without even talking about it. I remember growing up, I remember one time there was a bottle of champagne in the refrigerator, on the bottom shelf, tucked in the back, and they were saving it for some special occasion. And I think it probably got thrown away before it even ever got open.
Oh, what a shame.
That's the only time I ever remember, the only time I ever remember seeing alcohol in our house was this bottle of, I'm sure, the world's cheapest champagne.
Well, I grew up around a lot of alcohol, especially beer. My family was kind of the neighborhood party house. So I remember as a kid sitting outside and everybody would just kind of gather in our yard and they would just drink beer. And I was a kid and curious, and I'm like, I'll take a sip of this stuff and see how it tastes. And I thought it was horrible. I don't know what kind of beer, maybe Old Milwaukee.
Oh, classic.
So I remember
that might be the problem.
I remember, yeah, probably. Just thinking, I don't think I'll ever like beer, and I didn't like beer until I wouldn't say I ever really liked beer, but I drank beer, and I was kind of a weekend warrior. I was a musician, or still am a musician, but so I hung out in bars, and that's what people did. So it was sort of like, okay, I'm in a bar and I'm going to drink. I'm in a band. People buy me drinks, so it was just around a lot. But like I said earlier, I've always had that off switch where I could tell people, no, I don't want a shot. I do not want any more beer. I could do that. This is the late 80s through the 90s was when I was in the bars. And so it was, there was a lot of drug and alcohol use during those years that I witnessed. But I was fortunate. I had the off switch and never got a DUI, never got caught up in it.
You talk about, I think, with the millennial generation, Kyle, and Mike, being everything needing to be dramatic, right? Everything is an experience. Everything has to be over the top. There's an interesting statistic that for millennials, do you know what the top 3 medical diagnoses are for that generation? What do you think number 1 is?
What could it be? Medical, not mental health.
All combined, medical, mental health, all of it together.
Anxiety.
Major depression is the number 1 diagnosis for millennials.
That was going to be my second guess.
Number 2 is hypertension.
Oh, wow.
Which is interesting because y'all aren't that old yet. I mean, we're old, right? I mean, Mike and I are firmly in Gen X and probably toward the older end of it, but you guys aren't that old. And for this many of you to have hypertension,
we want the experience of hypertension. That's why
you want to be able to say you're on medications.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is.
But the third one is substance use disorders. It's the third most common. So there's only 2% of you that drink on a daily basis, but obviously a large number of millennials who are drinking enough to at least catch a diagnosis from some sort of provider. What's interesting that I read since 2019, so starting in 2020, and we all know what happened in 2020, but alcohol use among millennials has increased by 10%.
Wow.
And I wonder how much of it is just that social isolation and being forced, it's almost like none of us were allowed to go out and do our usual social things during COVID. And if you're a generation that's all about the social and being seen and being experienced, and you can't do that, you start to understand. I think drinking increased across the board during COVID. But
yeah, I would agree with you on that. Just in seeing after that happened and we were let out of our cages, so to speak, the amount of people that went into the recovery programs was pretty high.
Really?
From my experience.
Oh, after everything opened up?
Yep.
Our last podcast, we took kind of a historical look at being a real man. So we invited on this, we'll call him an older gentleman that we know.
It just at the polite term.
Yeah. We were giving him grief. He's actually not that old. He's only in his 70s. But
He's
we were,
spry.
yeah, that's right. He's a spry, still working, still active, still installing floors in his own home, and he's a busy guy. But we're talking to Mark about, kind of his historical perspective, with his dad and when he was growing up and what he's seen in the changes, and he certainly wasn't very complimentary of the newer generations. He readily admits that he's a kind of an old school guy with traditional values, and he talked about values. He just kept coming back to this thing, like, my values tell me this, my values came from that. And I think one of the questions that I have, and I know we're getting away from the alcohol conversation a little bit, but for the millennial generation, and I, like I said, I'm firmly entrenched in Gen X, and I think millennials in some ways kind of get an undeserved beating in some ways. And part of that is because you've got all of us Gen Xers who we grew up on latchkeys and water hoses, right? I mean, That's what you hear over and over again.
Yeah.
And we probably give ourselves a little too much credit for being self-raised and tough and all the rest of it.
No seatbelts.
No seatbelts, and we were told to go away until the street lights came on, and we had to drink water out of a hose in some stranger's yard. I mean, all the stories that we tell, half of which are true,
right?
But so we're here on one side of you millennials going, yeah, you guys are awful. None of you really want to do it. You can't get your lives together. You don't want to work, blah, blah, blah. But you guys as millennials are also getting beat up by the Gen Z group for being too something. So I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, like, what's it like sitting in the middle taking a beating all the time?
Well, it's something I would drink over, probably. No, it's sore subject. It's interesting because I think that we often, like the millennial generation, kind of gets lost a little bit because we had our feet in both worlds, so to speak. The pre and post internet age, which kind of changed things for a lot of people. I remember doing some of the things that you talked about, running around outside until the lights came on and drinking out of people's houses. I did that. But then I also, on the other hand, was sitting in front of a computer screen, waiting for AOL to boot up. So it was really interesting because we had the long.
You get on MySpace?
I wasn't a MySpace guy.
No, I thought all you guys were.
I was a young Facebook kid. When Facebook went public, I was all over that, and I was obsessed with it.
Really?
Yeah. Now I can't. I don't touch it. I don't touch stuff.
I think there's some overlap, Gen X and millennials, especially late Gen X and early millennials.
Yes.
A lot of the same experiences, and then suddenly the pace at which technology happened.
Absolutely. I remember having the long phone cord going to the living room and things like that. But then I also remember having a cell phone when I was relatively young.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting because I think that we often are stuck in the middle. Like what you were saying, Eric, is that we're not tough enough. And then sometimes we're not woke enough. I hate that term.
I think you've hit the nail.
We all hate that term, Kyle.
Yeah. I think it's we don't know who we're supposed to be. Sometimes identity is something that has always been a struggle for me. And I think that contributed a lot to my drinking, just not knowing who I was. My dad was a working class guy. He was a tradesman. And I thought that I was supposed to do that in order to be a man. And then I was kind of disappointed in myself that I didn't follow in his footsteps in a way.
That would be kind of millennial of you to not follow his footsteps and not go into the trades, right?
It would. But I almost felt like I was disappointing him.
Yeah.
He never pressured me to go into anything like that. If anything, he was like, don't do this. But I think there was a part of me that I think that I associated with being a man with doing labor.
Yeah.
That was how I was raised.
Yeah.
What made you think you disappointed him?
The fact that he didn't talk to me. He never really, I think that I'm a person that really needs praise, and because I'm a millennial. Um,
You said it.
I said it. I can say it. I love participation trophies. I think that's something that I crave as an individual, and that's something I never got.
So I saw this documentary that's coming out called Silent Men. I can't wait to see it.
Ooh, that sounds interesting.
This guy, let's see, Duncan Cowles, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Cowles. Talk to men. I think this is in the UK, but BBC. He says he thinks there's still a lot of societal pressure around traditional masculine traits and the pressure to have those traits, being strong and things associated with being a leader or this stable, reliable, dependable figure is still, he found that is still what they're supposed to be. Did you grow up feeling that way, or do you feel that way now?
Oh yeah, definitely. I was raised in a very much a household where men were not allowed to cry. That very much pull yourself up by your bootstraps esque mentality.
Yeah.
And I think that's hard for me to break away from.
One of the books I published was called "Thus Saith the Ward." It was one of my dad's favorite jokes. He thought he was funny. He wasn't, but he was convinced that he was. And I want to read you, I just pulled it up. I want to read you just a paragraph from the introduction to that book. And the book is all about the life lessons that I realized in many cases far too late that I had learned from him throughout his life. And some of them are funny and some of them are quite poignant. Some of them were intentionally taught and others quite by accident on his part. But I want to read you this paragraph. I said, father-son relationships have also been the subject of innumerable modern novels, television shows, and movies. And I said, the themes are similar throughout all of them. Men seem to always fear growing up to be like their fathers. At the same time, they desperately want to connect and bond with their dad. And most are worried about not being good enough to earn the approval of good old dad that they so desperately seek, whether they realize it or not. And does that kind of reflect your experience?
That checks every single box. It's hard for me because I don't know. It's just difficult.
But I think I know, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, that it is a common theme for men who end up coming to see a counselor, whether they're there for themselves or for relationship counseling, this father-son thing, much more so than mother-daughter relationships, seems to eat away at men. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we just don't talk enough. We don't share. We don't disclose. We're not transparent as often. I think sometimes we just don't allow ourselves to be vulnerable in those relationships. And so they end up being surface level relationships. And in those, we never really know what the other person thinks of us or how things are going. And that's true at work, at life, and anywhere else. And so, to have that in your relationship with one of your parents is challenging for people. I used in that book, you talk about movies, right? Because everywhere you look in movies and television and everything else, there are examples of this father something. And it goes all the way back in history, all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans. There are example after example of bad father-son relationships. And I use the example of from Star Wars, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. I said he's probably one of the best examples of being a bad dad. And I said he was so bad that he fathered a son whose mom took him and hid him on another planet just to keep him away from his dad. And I said even worse, his enemies hated him so much that they managed to successfully recruit his son to kill him and blow up his cool new office building. All of which resulted in Vader deciding to introduce himself to his previously unmet son for the first time by challenging him to a duel, while his boss gleefully encouraged him to kill his own offspring. I don't think fathers get any worse than that. And of course, it's fictitious, but I think there's a reason that those kind of things resonate with men in particular. It really is a reflection of how we are with our own dads. And so I don't know. I don't know that it's ever going to go away. I think it's getting better. You think about even just you sitting here saying like, hey, there's a conversation that I should probably have with my dad at some point. I think for Gen X, I was an unusual one, to go sit down and actually have that conversation with my dad. And he was clearly not super comfortable with it when I had it with him, but he was kind enough to sit there and hear me out. But
yeah, it's interesting because I've talked to some other, like my male friends. I've actually asked them if they've had conversations like that with their fathers, and they say no. And then it's interesting because I don't know if I'm seeking out people that are just like me, that are in similar situations where they don't talk to their dads, or if this is just a phenomenon.
One of the things in this article about this documentary is the filmmaker says, so the filmmaker is the first to admit his own struggles to open up emotionally, especially with those closest to him, and joking that tackling the subject for the documentary was like dragging myself backwards through a hedge. So he's saying, it's almost harder the closer you are to somebody to open up about that stuff. And it's almost easier to open up to strangers, opening up to our dads. Like that's pretty vulnerable.
I agree with you on that. I think that the idea of opening up to strangers is so much easier for me.
Yeah.
I think I had some of the best conversations I ever had in a bar.
Yeah.
And I was probably drunk.
Yeah. I much less vulnerable when you're drinking and talking to strangers.
More seriously, though, I think that that's absolutely true. When there's for me at least, the idea that maybe this person who I will maybe never meet again may not, I'm able to open up to them a little bit more so than my own dad.
Yeah. Kyle, to bring it full circle, is this why 12-step groups work? Because it's strangers?
I think largely you're absolutely right. Talking with somebody about your substance use is so difficult because they know all of that. They know your backstory. They know who you are. They may have been there for some of the things that you did. Whereas with talking to a group of strangers is like you're able to unburden yourself, to be honest with other people that when you haven't been honest for years, decades. I think that it's a great unburdening.
You also can't bullshit anybody like in a 12-step.
You cannot bullshit a bullshitter. And they oh man, people that are in 12-step programs can smell it on you. They can. They will. They can spot you a mile away.
Yeah.
Especially if you're telling half truths, which is always my favorite thing. I like to dip a toe in the truth and make it seem like I'm being truthful, and I just don't give you the rest of the story.
So, Kyle, are you an alcoholic?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Will you always be?
I will always be an alcoholic.
Does it ever feel like an unnecessary burden to walk around with that title?
I don't even see it as a burden. The recovery process for me has been the best thing that's ever happened to me in my life. If I didn't have that, well, one, I'd be dead. Two, I think that I've done a lot of work on myself that I would not have done without the program. So for me, it's not really, it's something that I'm pretty open about with people. So I think that helps. I know that there are some people that are not as open about it. Yeah, I think that the way that I look at it is if my story can help at least one person, then it would have been that'll be worth it. And while I do carry some of that guilt and all of that baggage from things that I've done in the past, I don't necessarily see it as a burden. It's a way for me to kind of reach out and help people. So that's the way I choose to look at it.
I was working with a client once who many, many years prior had been in prison for some pretty significant theft, not surprisingly related to addiction. But
what?
I know, unheard
That's
of.
crazy.
But one of the things he was doing when I was working with him was he was trying to work to legally get his record cleared. It was never going to happen, but he was trying to do it. And his explanation for it was very black and white. He said, it doesn't matter where I go, what I do. Every time I fill out a job application, every time I apply for for the police or something, housing somewhere, he said it always comes back to me being a thief. And he said, for the rest of my life, I'm a thief. And it's interesting because in the legal system like that, they don't have the same recovery outlook like you do in addiction work, and you don't have the same recovery resources. There's no place to go to do what you just described, which is take this completely negative aspect of your life and use it to change not only yourself, but also to potentially help other people. And I guess that's why I ask the question. It just seems to me, as somebody who's never struggled with addiction, it seems to me to be a heavy burden to bear for life. But when I listen to you answer the question, there's no heavy in that. It's instead this thing that you've turned into this positive.
I think one of the major tenets of recovery is trying to be of maximum service to others. And I think that's why I sought out the careers that I did. I think that's why I seek out the people that I talk, like to associate with. I just find that having that mindset of trying to help other people is kind of what lessens the load of that burden.
So who serves you?
What do you mean?
What do you mean? What are you talking about?
What are you talking about? Who does that?
Your focus is on using yourself and your abilities and your past and the lessons you've learned to serve everyone else. You work in a service profession. Mm-hmm. You work for an organization that has a culture of service. Who serves you?
So I think for me, the recovery group, they keep me on the right track. When my ego is a little too inflated, they bring me down to size, which is really awesome. Because Lord knows that my ego can get a little inflated at times. There are people that I can talk to about things that might not be palatable to the layman. I don't know. I don't like to be the guy that likes to shout things from the mountaintop, because that's one thing that we don't like to do program. But I just like to tell people that there is a group of people that will do what you're asking.
Yeah. That there are multiple different kinds of leaders in life, right? And some of them are the stand up on the mountaintop and shout as loud as they can and encourage everybody else to climb up there with them. And then there are the quiet leaders. And it's too trite to say, oh, they lead by example. It's more than that, right? They might lead by example. And I'm saying this because I think what I know of you, what I've seen of you in your interactions with people, that's you, right? You're the quiet leader. And it's more than just setting the example by work. It's the quiet encouragement whispered in the ear, right? It's the passing comment that is always going to have a positive takeaway for people. And I think, when I've worked with people that have gone through recovery and are in recovery, and I don't know if this fits in with your experience, but there seems to be two kinds. There's the angry fighting against addiction kind, which to me seems just like a failing battle. You're going to lose that battle. If you are so hyper-focused on addiction that you are spending all day, every day fighting against it, well, that's where all of your focus and attention goes, which, it's like driving a car. You look in a certain direction, the car seems to follow. And I worry about those people, and I haven't seen them do well in recovery. But then there are the people like what you're describing, which is hey, I need to be humble. I need to be willing to always be knocked down a peg or seven. But I also need to serve and to be served. And to do that, I have to be vulnerable and I have to be honest and all those hard things for men to do.
Men are really bad at that.
I think you're describing servant leadership versus, the old-fashioned Machiavellian
Right.
leadership style. The servant leadership, when I learned about that, I was like, what? No, that's not how it's supposed to work. But actually learning more about what servant leadership does for people that work for you, it really is the best way to go. And so having that service mindset, I'm sure helps you, Kyle.
Yeah, absolutely. It totally does.
Eric, you were asking earlier as a clinician why I thought more men were in treatment, and I think it comes down to more men than women. Feelings, not knowing what to do with feelings, not knowing how we feel as men, and not being able to express them. So, alcohol, drugs, those are a perfect way to kind of stuff that and deal with those things. I can say from my own, when I started therapy with my current therapist, one thing that she asks me every single session is, how do you feel? And I always say, to this day, good. That's the first thing that comes out. How do you feel? Good. And then I have to go, wait, let me think about this. And she has a feelings pillow where you can see all the little.
Ooh,
and so
I like that.
I read that before I go in, and I'm like, okay, I want to get some better words than good.
So, Mike, I'm laughing because, at our agency, we run a treatment program for men who get court ordered after they get arrested for domestic violence offenses. And every group, it's a 26-week long program, so 6 months. Every one of those 26 weeks, right? Every guy in that group is going to start with a check-in. And part of the check-in is, how do you feel today? And we have to tell them there are certain words we don't allow. We don't allow fine. We don't allow good. We don't allow okay. And we literally have to give them a sheet in their folder that has all of these different feeling words on it.
I know.
And almost every guy every week has to pull this sheet out and look at it and sit there and go, I feel jealous today, or whatever the feeling is. Like, men are so bad at identifying feelings. We have to give them cheat sheets.
Yeah, we're terrible at that.
What's funny though is that if you read the research, I came across this one time, that when you compare men to women, we are far worse at identifying what feelings we're having, but we're far better at identifying the fact that we're having feelings. And that sounds really weird, right?
Yeah.
But I think, you think about like the typical man-woman argument, a woman will get upset and start, that'll start affecting the content or the tone of the argument. And if you say to her, like, hey, you seem like you're angry. And I'm not. I'm just explaining, like, they can't. Now, if they actually sit down and think about it, they can tell you exactly what they're feeling, how long they've been feeling, where it comes from, how it's impacting them, and what they would like you to do about it. But they have to take the time to recognize it. We men are better at saying, like, I'm having some kind of feeling here. We just don't know what it is.
Right.
And so we just stop. Right. Give me a beer.
I can identify with that for sure. Like a lot of in my early 20s, I knew that I was feeling things and I didn't like that. I didn't know what they were, but I didn't like it. And I thought, for me, it was I'd rather feel nothing than feel whatever this is.
Yeah.
So I think that was a large part of my drinking.
So let's talk about that, because you kind of alluded to that early on. You said it was, probably self-medicating, and it took you a long time to figure that out. What was it that you were self-medicating?
Largely, I think anxiety has always been a huge part of my life. Depression and anxiety, but mostly anxiety, a lot of worry. I think combined with like control issues.
It's interesting because your millennial generation is very anxious. They're not quite as anxious as the Gen Zers. All of them seem to be on medication.
Yeah.
But the millennial generation is very, very anxious.
That's true.
And I'm wondering how much of that is because of us, the Gen Xers. Like, did we raise anxious kids, or is it societal? Like, did I break my kids? I don't know what happened.
Yeah. It's your fault.
But it's my fault. So it's all right. I've been fully blamed by my offspring. So
I'm sure. I don't know. Yeah, I would agree with you on that in terms of like the generational the great anxiety. I think there's just a lot of uncertainty about what is going to happen with our generation from a lot of different perspectives. So I think that worry is a big thing for us.
What do you mean uncertainty about what's going to happen?
I think that there's a lot of times like an identity crisis is like what we're supposed to do, what we're supposed to become, what's our end goal? You know, like, will we ever be able to retire? I don't know. I think that there's a lot of questions and we don't have answers for them. And I think that also makes us anxious. I think it makes me anxious.
And it's so funny because being Gen X, you know, like the standard Gen X response to that is like, you know, stop your whining, go to work, everything will be fine. Right. It was fine for us. We figured it out. You know, our parents were nowhere to be found, and yet we turned out okay. Not really sure we turned out okay, but that's a whole nother discussion.
Delusions.
Delusions of grandeur.
Self-grandeur.
We're perfect. We're fine. There's nothing wrong with us. Nothing to see here.
Yeah.
But I think there's still a part of me, like if I'm honest, that listens to those conversations from both Millennial and Gen Z. And like, I want to roll my eyes sometimes because I'm like, okay, you're anxious. That's nice. Go to work. And of course, it's coming from somebody who's never struggled with anxiety, never had to deal with real, you know, panic or worry that becomes debilitating in a clinical sense. But, you know, it's not even just the anxiety. It's, you know, Mike, like you were talking about earlier, where even like regular eating and drinking has to be a thing. You know, like everything is so full of showmanship and energy and everything else. And you know, and I'm the guy, like, I love to cook and I love to make fancy meals. I love to smoke on the barbecue. I love everything in between. But it's not a show to me. It's I want to make food that people love. You know, my wife always jokes that cooking is my way of giving people hugs, right? Because I'm not a hugger, surprisingly.
What?
I know, shocking revelation. But, you know, part of why I love to cook is because I want people to love it. I want people to enjoy it. But it's not a show, right? I want people to clean their plate and ask for seconds. And I'm like, all right, I did something right.
Right.
I don't need a pronouncement. I don't need, you know, somebody to stand up and announce how they liked it. And I think that's one of the things that from my generation, you know, and I'm stereotyping here, but we look at your generation and then maybe even more so at Gen Z and think, why does everything have to be such a big deal?
It's interesting that you bring that up because when we look back towards the Gen X generation, is that there's this idea that you have to be producing something in order to be worthy. And I think that there was a rejection of that with millennials. So I think experiences versus products have become more of a accepted form of worthiness.
We see it like even, you know, running a nonprofit organization and ours doesn't really do a lot of fundraising. But when we do, if we have one of those events where we're auctioning things off, nobody wants stuff anymore.
Right.
Everybody wants experiences. The most money we ever made off of a single auction item was when the Chicago Cubs donated this package where you could throw out the first pitch at the game. You could spend half the game sitting inside the Wrigley Field scoreboard.
That's cool.
And the rest of the game sitting in this box suite. And it went for so much money. And the guy that finally bought it, he's like, oh yeah, my son's graduated from college. And, you know, he and I have been Cubs fans since he was little. And we just want to have this experience.
Yeah.
And so I think there's truth to that. I think you're right. They've rejected so much of the Gen X generation in particular. You know, I get frustrated when you're like, okay, boomer. Like if I hear that one more time.
I try not to say it.
And I get boomers and Gen X's can both be equally loud and obnoxious in our lecturing and condescending of other generations. But I also think there's something to be learned. You know, I look back at my grandfather, you know, who was, you know, a World War II veteran and quiet man, didn't speak a lot. But when he talked, I would shut up because there was probably something to be learned from him, even when I didn't agree.
I absolutely agree with you on that. I think this is largely an issue that I don't even know if this is a generational issue, but I think that a lot of people don't listen to people they disagree with. I think that millennials, in my experience, tend to create echo chambers and like to hear each other talk and don't necessarily, maybe they do listen to outside opinion, but are quick to dismiss that.
Eric, you said something earlier. Is it our fault as Gen X parents?
No.
And I'm trying to think. We were told to let our children express themselves. We weren't encouraged to express our feelings. I wonder if there's some of that, and that anxiety is a pretty universal feeling that most people can pinpoint. And so I wonder if they're just more willing to express, I have anxiety, or encouraged to express any kind of feeling.
I agree with that. And I also think that anxiety has become just like craft beer.
Delicious?
No. Everybody has to have their own unique version of expensive.
That's probably.
Everybody has to have their own unique version of anxiety. Well, my anxiety comes from this, or my anxiety looks like that, or I'm on these 2 medications as opposed to this. It's like another thing.
It's an interesting trend, that I've noticed. This might be more of a Gen Z thing in regards to social media, but I have noticed that having a mental health diagnosis is almost like a badge of honor, and they tend to play that up a little bit. I don't know, and I certainly don't want to say that anybody's exaggerating symptoms.
Well, I think it's a language thing, like you're saying. As someone who's had panic attacks when I was younger, when I hear people say I had a panic attack and I know that they didn't, it kind of makes me mad.
Yeah, same.
Makes me a little like, you really had a panic attack? Because
it's not great.
I don't think you would say that.
No, you wouldn't.
And OCD is another one that people kind of just use. I'm OCD, and and you're right. It's like almost a bragging. And if you had OCD, you wouldn't be bragging.
Yeah. No, you certainly wouldn't. It's interesting that the mental health diagnosis has kind of become a part of people's identity.
Yeah.
Whereas before, I think a lot of people saw that as almost like some sort of shame, or
exactly
because of stigma and things like that. And I think we've made a lot of progress in that regard, and maybe this is a good thing in some aspects.
Yeah.
While I think it might be unhealthy in others, but it's an interesting generational change.
So, Mike, as always, I'm going to ask you, what is your takeaway for today's episode?
So thank you, Kyle, for joining us for this podcast. I liked hearing your history with alcohol and how that you've embraced 12 steps to get through it. And I think, our podcast is about being traditionally and authentically male. It's interesting to hear you as a millennial still, when I brought up that Silent Men documentary, that feelings are still a hard thing to bring up. It's always probably going to be a difficult thing for men. Maybe someday it'll go away. But thanks for sharing, your experience with your feelings. It was nice talking to you about that.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I've had a really great time. This has been really fun. I hope that at my incoherent rambling, there was some sort of gem.
There was nothing incoherent about it. So, Kyle, I just want to say thank you. I think it's impressive, given your struggles and given the things that you've had to battle through, your ability to come on and speak quite coherently, but also quite transparently about them. I've met a lot of people who feel the need to hide their past and hide their struggles, and it sounds like that's not an issue for you. So kudos to you, and thank you for sharing your story with us. Kyle, I'm going to ask you a really blunt question. Are you a real man?
No.
How do you know?
How do you know?
I don't know. I don't know what that means.
I think that's part of why we're doing this. I don't think any of us know what it means, and we're trying to figure it out. And so far, we're just coming up with more questions than answers, but that's a good thing.
I think that it's such a complex question. It's nuanced, it's layered, it's all of that. And I think we maybe scratched the surface a little bit today.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Yeah, when Eric asked me if I wanted to do this podcast, I was like, well, I don't have anything to offer. I don't know what it is to be a real man.
Right.
But I'm glad we're talking about it. And the feedback I've gotten so far, it's been really positive that this is something that I think at least men will be interested in.
Yeah,
I hope so.
Women too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that, yeah, I think that real men talk about what it means to be a real man.
And that's a very millennial thing to say. And we'll end
It
on
absolutely
that
is.
note. Kyle, thank you for being here. Mike, as always, thank you for your contributions. And we will see you all next time around.
See you later.
Thank you very much. See you later.